Thanks, Fred, and thanks, everyone. Today I'm going to chat to you about our project that we're working on in conjunction with the University of Copenhagen and University of Ghana. So it's funded by the Novo Nordisk Foundation for about 5 years, but our trials have been funded for only 3. So in most cases, we've got 3 sets of seasonal data. Essentially, with glacial rock flour, there is some slight differences with basalt and some of the other rock minerals in that glacial rock flour itself is very fine, so it's about 3 micrometers in size. And you actually have it milled by melting ice sheets in Greenland. So as these melt, they mill the rock bed underneath, and then you get pools of the rock dust that form at the bottom. And the idea is that then you could go out with a ship, for example, collect these up, and it's almost ready to go as a product that you could put in soil. So essentially, we're doing trials around the world. Our focus is in Australia. There's about 6 work packages we're looking at as part of this. So looking at soil applications and then the mechanisms that might be occurring that lead to increased yields and carbon sequestration. There's also work packages looking at applications in oceans as well. And then changes to biological community structures. And finally, then looking at potential marketing opportunities for the glacial rock flour. So from my side of the project, so the main aim is to investigate the efficacy of glacial rock flour application and how that changes across different environments. As we know, Australia has quite a number of different environments, from grassland and tropical climates to temperate, for example, different levels of rainfall, different soil types as well. So from our side, it's been sort of a great model to work with, to go to different sort of systems and see any potential weathering effects and benefits. In terms of the trial sites themselves, so we had about 10 set up for this study. We had 5 in New South Wales, with 2 irrigated sites as well at Murrumbidgee and Whitten, and then 2 sugarcane sites in Queensland, 2 rain-fed sites in WA, and then 1 rain-fed site in Balaclava in South Australia. You can see here just some quick snapshots of the trials over the years. So that's sugarcane at Norwell into the growing season. And then here we've got reapplication of the glacial rock flour at one of the sites at Tabata at New South Wales. And you can actually see the rock flour here. So for the most part, it is a fine dust that you can spread across to the plots. At our irrigated sites, so we had canola at Whitten at one point, and then at Murrumbidgee we also had wheat growing as well. So you can see already that quite a few different environments to work with. For the most part, the site setup and management was kept consistent. So we had about 8 treatments that we were interested in looking at. Obviously, untreated controls to compare back to, and then a range of glacial rock flour application rates. So we had anywhere from 10 tonnes per hectare to 50 tonnes per hectare, also including a repeat 10 tonne per hectare treatment for multi-year trials. And we also finally had a business as usual treatment. And what all of this allowed us to do is, well, determine, do we have impacts of glacial rock flour on plant and soil health metrics over time? So we could look at it from that perspective. We could also look at categorical comparisons, so looking at particular GRF application rates compared to business as usual and untreated control treatments. And then finally, if we wanted to look at the differences between reapplication and just standalone treatment at the beginning of the cropping season. So there's a few different ways that this setup allowed us to investigate the efficacy of the glacial rock flour. In terms of the site and soil climate properties, so there was quite a big difference in some of these. I've kind of highlighted them, but for pH, for example, we had some really acidic sites at Norwell and Woongoolba in Queensland here. And then we had some more neutral pH sites, for example, Geraldton, sort of around that 7 mark. Big differences in soil organic carbon as well, so anywhere from 0.3% to 3%. Exchangeable K levels, and also precipitation and temperature. So some of these sites are really dry. So I'll give the example of Balaclava up here. So really dry, so very little rainfall throughout our growing seasons, and also quite hot compared to the other sites. And then if you look at Norwell, for example, so similar sort of temperature at around 20 degrees, but much, much more rainfall. So you're getting a lot more water for those crops and the soil. So that brings me to our results, and I'll present to you some of our yield results and the trends we've seen today. So Queensland, so at our Norwell and Moongulba sites, that's where we've actually seen the most benefit on yield. So we had 2 years of trials, for example, at Norwell with sugarcane crops. In our first year, we saw a significant trend, so a positive correlation between our glacial rock flower application. And then in our second year, it seemed to be a stronger response again. We also saw differences in the yield as well between the 2 seasons. But what we didn't see was an interaction between GRF application and a particular season compared to another. So what I mean by that is GRF didn't have any difference in season 2 compared to season 1. If we look at Moongulba, we actually didn't have as much of a strong effect. It was just significant, and we still did see a bit of a difference between the 2 seasons, but also the same trend where we actually didn't see differences in glacial rock flower effect between the 2 yields. A lot of our other sites, so if I move to, say, Mount Barker as an example, but this can also apply to Tabbata and Binya in New South Wales, Geraldton in WA. So a lot of the time, we actually wouldn't see a correlation between yield and GRF application. So it wouldn't benefit yield and it wouldn't negatively impact yield. So you can see here a lot of the time we're seeing these sorts of trends where we had barley in the first year, then we rotated to canola, and then we finished with barley in the third year. But yeah, it didn't appear that glacial rock flower was actually improving yield. Whether it was weathering itself is something we're still investigating, so we're still going through a lot of our soil analyses and plant data. But when it comes to yields, this was a lot of the trends that we actually saw. Similarly, so for the irrigated sites, so Whitten and Murrumai, you would see trends like this, again, where we're not really seeing an impact on yield at all. But then is likely different reasons for that as well, for why we're not seeing those impacts, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. Occasionally, so at Balaclava in South Australia, so I pointed this one out for a particular reason when I was talking about the climate and soil properties. We actually saw a negative trend between application of glacial rock flower and yield across all 3 years. So we started with chickpea and we saw a negative response. So as you increased glacial rock flower application, you actually reduced yield. And this actually continued for wheat as well. So we grew wheat in the second year and we also saw that trend. And then finally for lentil, we do see that trend, but actually we saw a bit of a difference on the effect of the glacial rock flower. So actually it starts to flatten out by the third year. So you start to reduce that negative impact. So I guess for us, the story so far, so we've only seen that positive effect on yield in our sugarcane crops in Queensland, more so at Norwell. Not much correlation at the other sites, and yeah, a negative trend, for example, at Balaclava. And so thinking about why these might be the case, in a lot of cases, it could be a lack of water. So because a lot of our crops rely on rainfall, if we haven't had a lot of rainfall during those seasons, we might see that we're not getting a lot of weathering. In the case of South Australia, for example, it could be an effect of having salinity associated with the glacial rock flower. So that's something we're still investigating. But glacial rock flower can have a high level of sodium associated with it as it's collected from those waterways. Usually, once you apply it, that washes away if you have enough water. But perhaps if you haven't got enough there initially, it does tend to hang around in the soil and perhaps have a negative impact. Another thing we identified, perhaps not enough dissolved CO2 exposure. So for us, when we were setting up these trials, initially we spread at the surface and then mixed into the soil through sowing in a lot of cases. Through discussions with colleagues at Denmark and learning about sort of different setups that they had overseas, we thought, well, maybe we needed to mix it a bit deeper to improve exposure to those dissolved CO2 levels in soil to improve weathering. Or in some cases, it could be that there's too much high background nutrient levels. So if you've got a high level of exchangeable cations, for example, when we actually go to measure weathering effects or look for improvements on yield, perhaps the glacial rock flour just isn't being able to have an impact. So any nutrient that might be produced or made available doesn't, in the scheme of things, make a difference because there's already a high level of background nutrient. And that would happen at places like, for example, Witten and Murrumbidgee, where you've got fertigation happening and you've got fertilizer being applied to all your plots. So it could be masking some of those weathering effects too. I guess for us, at this stage, I'm thinking the Queensland climate itself, so having those high levels of rainfall, the management practices, and what I mean by that is at the start, the glacial rock flour was hilled within the actual plants themselves. So you can see here, for example, the sugarcane, it's been growing for a few weeks at the start. The glacial rock flour was incorporated as part of that hilling process where the soil is brought up closer to the plant roots, which would have perhaps mixed it a bit deeper, and then it hasn't been touched since because the crops have been retuning. And then the crop choice itself. So I guess sugarcane being a crop that may benefit from the available silica that may come from the glacial rock flour, perhaps we're seeing an effect from that. So we're also measuring silica as part of this to see if that's going to be the case. In terms of the further investigation, so we'll be looking at changes in pH within soil, exchangeable nutrient capacities, changes in total N as well, and available P. So generally all your soil health profile measurements that you want to do. In terms of the weathering itself, so our colleagues in Denmark are taking a soil mass balance approach to trying to estimate weathering, but we're constantly looking for ways that we can improve it and make it more accurate. In terms of the plant samples, so plant cuts from these trials, it'll be looking at uptake in nutrients, so looking to see if that's changed with glacial rock flour application. And finally, next steps for this project. So all our field trials are finished. It's processing the remaining samples, collating all the data sets that we have for publications, and looking at perhaps collaboration opportunities, whether they're glacial rock flour related or other spaces in the enhanced weathering space. Thanks for listening, and I'd like to acknowledge everyone that's helped as part of the project.